We have that kind of history going back as well. And I was also, I should say, I was that kid growing up who was pretty much at church every time the doors were open. So, I was there Sunday mornings, Sunday afternoon for choir practice, Sunday night for Sunday evening services, Monday night, visitation, Tuesday night Bible study, Wednesday night prayer meeting, you name it. I was kind of there, and all the way through my youth. And I went to a Baptist college. I have a degree from the Southern Baptist Seminary, even I think kind of going back to this cognitive dissonance point, and maybe a way in here is, it really wasn't until I was in my early 20s in seminary, right? Even having gone through a whole, Baptist college experience, that I heard anything really honest about the origins of my home denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention. I was sitting in a Baptist history class, having 20 years of discipleship at my back, and it was new to me to find out that, that virtually every Protestant denomination in the country split over the issue of slavery, and that in our case, the Baptist North and South split, and that the origins of the Southern Baptist Convention were this split in 1845, when Baptists in the South put forward a candidate to be appointed to missions, who was a slave owner, and the Northern Baptists rejected it. They put this forward actually very intentionally as a test case, and at that moment, Baptists in the South sort of formed their own denomination, and it was explicitly about making it okay and compatible that one could enslave other human beings on the basis of the color of their skin and be a minister of the gospel, that these two things could go hand in hand, and not just coincidentally, but in the way that it was actually constructed, that these two things were as it should be, right? This was actually an expression of God's ideal design for human society, a kind of hierarchical worldview, with whites over, non-whites. And so that really sat with me, and it was jarring when I first heard that in my early 20s, especially given that I had been in all these Baptist history classes and all the way through, and never really gotten the straight story about that. So this book is kind of, I think, in many ways my own personal journey, and what really pushed me to put pen to paper over the last 5 years. Really were a series of events. Many of those, I'm sure, many of you have kind of caused some, cognitive dissonance. But just to name them, the ones that really kind of pushed me were the killing of 9 African Americans in Charleston, South Carolina, by Dylan Roof back in 2015. 3 years ago, the marches in Charlottesville with people chanting "Jews will not replace us" and other neo-Nazi slogans as they were kind of gathering around a Confederate monument to Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville, at which one protester was actually killed. One of the white supremacists drove a car into the crowd there, and I think just these events being I think moving really to front and center in public, and people saying these things out loud. I think that for a while had been kind of behind closed doors or not really out in the mainstream, and realizing, I think, that these two things, like this experience of the role that Christianity had played in legitimizing this worldview, really, of whites over non-whites, and these more recent events were really connected. And just one quick example on the Charleston thing, I talk about this in the book, but the Dylan Roof, for example, was a baptized Lutheran, right? He was a member of the in good standing at an evangelical Lutheran church, ELCA church, which is a mainline Protestant denomination like the UCC, right? It's not an evangelical denomination, not from the Deep South, but part of a mainline denomination, and that he actually saw his Christian faith as part of his worldview, where he was really trying to start a race war by murdering 9 people as they were sitting in church. And this was very much integrated in his journals that they actually used at trial, that he had in prison with him. The text of it got a lot of coverage in the media because he was writing about kind of a manifesto, a kind of white supremacist manifesto that he was writing here. But what didn't get a lot of attention, actually, were the Christian symbols that were accompanying this kind of philosophical manifesto. And he was doodling all through the journal. I think there's more than a dozen crosses in the margins as he's doodling, a couple of full page crosses, and then one in particular that I actually reproduced in the book because I thought it was so striking, is of a white Jesus emerging resurrected from the tomb, right? And it's not a crude drawing. It's actually one that's quite sophisticated. That looks like it picks up on a lot of iconography from the Middle Ages, a lot of that you'll see in Orthodox Christianity representations of Jesus. So it's someone who really knows, this history, and he saw this really as very compatible. And I think it's easy to dismiss that as something incidental to somebody who's deranged. But I think the thing that I've tried to do in the book is to take these moments seriously and to ask, well, how can this be that these things sit so comfortably together in Christian faith? And I'll talk just a little bit about the book has kind of three main pieces. Part of it is memoir, kind of my own story of my own family and my own kind of journey on these issues. The other one is kind of history and kind of laying out how not only support for slavery, but support for white supremacy has really that survived very easily. Kind of the abolition of slavery has continued all the way up through the 20th century. And then the third piece, which is really more what I do in my day job, is as a social scientist, looking at contemporary public opinion data and asking the question, well, how is this still with us today? Because I think one of the things that I grew up thinking was that this even after I discovered the truth about kind of the origins of my own denomination, it seemed further back than in the present. And so one of the things I try to do in the book is to ask, well, how is this with us currently today? And I'll go over just a couple of that, and then then we'll just be in conversation after that. But I'll kind of lay out the kind of quantitative survey data that I think gives us a hint to how deeply this is, and disturbingly, these attitudes are still with us today. And again, I think the important part is not with us today just in the South or among evangelicals, but very much with us today outside the South, and very much with us today in mainline Protestant denominations and also among white Catholics as well. It really is all white Christian groups where you can still see the legacy of this history in the contemporary DNA of white Christianity, really across the board. So I lay out just a couple of things here. One of the things that I did in the book is to use contemporary public opinion data to look particularly at attitudes toward structural racism, right? So not just do I feel warmly toward someone who's African American, but to ask about things like the Confederate flag, Confederate monuments, the killing of unarmed African Americans by police, mass incarceration, these other kinds of issues that are really about the legacy of structural inequalities and how they're still with us today, and to kind of look at how white Christians perceive those things, particularly compared to whites who are not Christian. And I think this was the biggest surprise to me of how clear this pattern was, is that if you ask the question, who among whites, who is closer to the views of African Americans on a whole range of these issues around structural racism, the answer is not white Christians. The answer is whites who are not Christian, hold attitudes. They're much more likely to to acknowledge the existence of structural racism and to have views that are, again, very much closer to African Americans. So just a couple of concrete examples here. On the issue that's really been in front of us all spring and summer, the killing of African American men by police. We ask about this, and our question asked people whether they saw them as isolated incidents or whether they saw them as part of a pattern of how police treat African Americans. And on this question, when you compare, again, white Christians to whites who are not Christian or who hold no religious affiliation, white Christians are about 25 percentage points more likely than whites who are unaffiliated to say the killing of unarmed black men by police are isolated incidents. In other words, they have very much difficulty or are unwilling to sort of connect the dots between these incidents, whereas whites who are unaffiliated look very much like African Americans, much more likely to say these things are part of a pattern of how police treat African Americans. We have very similar findings on things like Confederate flags of monuments. So, for example, Confederate flag, white Christians of all kinds, that, again, evangelical, mainline, and white Catholic, are at least 30 percentage points more likely than whites who are religiously unaffiliated to say that the Confederate flag is more a symbol of Southern pride than they are to say it is a symbol of racism. So again, whites who are not religious, much closer to the views of African Americans on this thing. And I use a number of questions like that. In fact, 15 different questions to build a composite measure that I call the racism index, that were all different kinds of measures of structural racism. So in addition to Confederate symbols, there were questions about African American economic mobility and the limits to that, criminal justice system, and general perceptions of racial discrimination as part of a legacy of the past. And again, the pattern was just so clear, and that is that white Christians overall register much higher scores. And it's notable here that perhaps nobody was surprised about how that white evangelicals score highly. So on this scale, I scored it 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest, holding the most racist views, 1 being holding the least racist views on this index that are made of these composite questions. White evangelicals scored 8 out of 10 on that scale. But here's maybe the surprise, particularly talking to UCC group, part of the mainline group, that white mainline Protestants, of which the UCC is a part, scored 7 out of 10 on this index, and white Catholics, who have their own history of discrimination in the country, also scored 7 out of 10 on this. And you compare that to whites who are unaffiliated, they only scored 4 out of 10. And so even when I really dug in deeper and we're looking to see, okay, well, this correlation is there, but perhaps it's explainable by something else. So I looked at, for example, maybe partisanship explains it, maybe education levels explain it, maybe region of the country explains it, gender explains it, a bunch of other variables, even controlling for a number of alternative explanations. It turns out that this relationship between holding more racist attitudes and identifying as a white Christian is absolutely robust. It holds up and it is still there. It's an independent relationship, even holding all other things constant. And the other thing that I checked that's I think important to note here is that because one alternative might be to say, well, maybe these are people who are just Christian in name only. Maybe they haven't really been to church that much. They haven't really been, they're not part of Bible studies, or they're not listening to sermons. They're not really haven't had Christian formation as part of a Christian community. But even when I looked at church attendance levels, at best they made no difference. And that is the strength of this relationship between holding more racist attitudes and identifying as a white Christian were just as strong overall among those who went to church more than or once a week or more than those who went much less. And among white evangelical Protestants, that group that Southern Baptists are part of and that I grew up in, it's actually more disturbing than that. It turns out that just among that group, the relationship between holding more racist views and identifying as a white evangelical is actually stronger among those who attend church more frequently. Than it is among those who attend church less frequently. So all that to say is that basically, you boil all this down, and what we see is that even in the contemporary public opinion data today, that if you take your average white person and you add Christianity, Christian identity, they actually move toward holding more racist attitudes and move away from the attitudes of sharing concerns of African Americans in the country. And again, these are independent relationships, not driven just by partisanship or something else. It's actually the Christianity that is doing the work of kind of moving white Christians higher on the scale and further away from the concerns of African Americans. So we can talk a little bit more about some of the history and maybe even some of my own story if we want to, but I'll kind of come to the end here and just say this, that I think that we're clearly, as you all know, facing, a crossroads on racial justice issues in the country. And in many ways, I think that, the question is kind of being called as it has been in the past. And I think the real question is where white Christians in particular who played, and kind of where I land the book is to kind of put this question back to white Christians. And so if we have indeed played this role, which history, not only history, but current social science data suggests we've not only played this role, but it's still with us today in legitimizing white supremacy throughout all of American history. What is going to be our role in dismantling, this legacy in the current generation? And I'll end with a quote from James Baldwin, who I sort of read a lot of, and in some ways I actually think of this book as a white Christian response to Baldwin, who was, I think, he himself grew up Christian and was dismayed, I think, that white Christians weren't really, as King was, that white Christians didn't really rally around the civil rights movement and couldn't really see the justice of it for the most part. And what he called on, many of you may have read this, but in The Fire Next Time, there's this line that I think has stayed with me, where he talks about the importance of telling the truth. And I think in letting that cognitive dissonance begin to do the work, in our souls and in our psyches, to kind of help move us to a different place. And that was really for him also, like, really the important thing is telling the truth, even if it's painful, even if it's bitter, to try to tell the truth. And these are his words. He said, if we can muster the humility, courage, and love to tell the truth, we might just be able to, quote, end the racial nightmare, achieve our country, and change the history of the world. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Robby. Didn't he also, in that, maybe not in that section, what's that quote he talks about? Unless you face it, you can't change it. That quote.
Yeah, no, it's in a different piece, but it's another great quote. I think that it goes right in. He's said, not everything that can be faced can be changed.
Right.
But nothing can be changed until it is faced,
right.
Which I think is right on point.
Right.
I mean, both of these things he wrote more than 50 years ago, but, are relevant as if he had penned them this morning, I think.
And I don't know if it was in your book or not, Robby, but wasn't it, I think it was Frederick Douglass, or talked about that time that slave owners were worse if they went to church. Is that in your book, or was I reading that somewhere else?
Yeah, that's there. Yeah, I reread the first autobiography of Frederick Douglass, and I had forgotten. Actually, I'd read it before, and I had forgotten. For those of you who've read it, you may want to go take a look at it again too. I had forgotten. He has an entire appendix at the end of his first autobiography on Christianity and on his experience with Christianity, as an enslaved person, and then as someone sort of with his freedom and fighting to end slavery. And he concluded there and said that it was both his experience and a widely accepted experience of other enslaved people. In fact, the way he put it, basically, I'll finish this and I'll put the way he put it, that being a person who became the property of a Christian a slave master was actually worse than being the property of someone who was not Christian. And in fact, he put it so sharply. He said, other than being a slave, other than the fact of being a slave, I cannot imagine any worse thing that could happen to me than to become the property of a Christian slave master.
Right. So, Robby, thank you for all this. Before we go to general questions, I'm seeing folks are putting some in the chat, which is great. Keep doing that, friends. But before we go to that, Robby, would you talk about I think the social science is so strong in this book. I mean, that's what's so hard to argue with when you feel defensive about it. But and again, I think I said this maybe on Thursday, but as a minister, it's a little discouraging sometimes to read things like this. I mean, most of us are called into the ministry because we want to do good in the world. We want to transform, right, things. But can you talk a little bit about, because I think this is what you do so brilliantly in the book, talk about the theological underpinnings, maybe one or two of the ones that you think are the strongest or sturdiest that are holding up these racist structures by white Christians. Could you talk about one or two of those theological underpinnings? Because I think it's very helpful to unpack those.
Yeah, I'll do that. I see one quick question I can do on the way there too, about age in the models, and age was certainly something that I controlled for in the models. So it turns out that even controlling for age, this distinction between white Christians and whites who are unaffiliated holds up. So it is true that whites who are unaffiliated trend younger, but even when I take that out as a factor by putting in age as a control variable in the statistical models, this relationship holds up. So it's not just driven, in other words, it's not driven by age. It still is the Christian identity continues to be the distinctive thing that is kind of pushing whites in two different directions on that. So theologically, I mean, I've got, for those of you who are data wonks and really want to take a deep dive, there's plenty to sink your teeth into. For those of you who are not, and I have contained the stats really to one chapter in the book, so the pay dirt is there if you really want it. There's appendices with like regression model outputs. You can really go down the rabbit hole if you want on the statistics, but I have really written this with a kind of non-technical audience in mind. But the theology part of it, I think is only one way for us to kind of one window to looking how this has all been kind of built in, if you will, or baked in. I kind of talk about it as kind of being baked into the DNA of white Christianity in the country. And so if you think about one way of maybe I think helping to kind of understand this is if you think about the early churches in the American colonies. When slavery was, either tolerated or at best tolerated, but accepted and part of the normal commercial kind of part of capitalism, in the early colonies here in the country. What church often looked like were white slave owners bringing enslaved people to church with them, right? That was a not unusual thing. You can still see this in the architecture of churches, and not just in the South. There were either slaves sat in the back or enslaved people sat in these specially constructed galleries. They were actually called slave galleries up in the balcony behind. And if you just kind of sit with that for a minute and you sort of say, okay, if that's the kind of early seedbed of American Christianity, what kind of sermons could get preached in an environment like that, right? What kind of hymns could get sung? What scripture would get read? You're not going to read Exodus, and talk about the liberation of the enslaved Israelites. I mean, you're going to not give that text a lot of play, I don't think. You're probably not going to give Galatians a lot of play. There is either, no Jew nor Gentile, nor slave nor free, no men nor women, like those distinctions don't matter. Probably not going to get a lot of play. As well, but slaves obey your masters in Ephesians. That's probably going to make its way to the headlines pretty regularly. So I think thinking about all of that, and that the thing that I think has stuck with me so much is that that was, I think, first a very explicit affirmation of most white Christian churches in the country. Just the sense that there was this hierarchical worldview that was very widely accepted. It was accepted by abolitionists as well as those supporting slavery, that white people who saw themselves as white coming from Western Europe were superior to other races. I mean, this was a very fundamental belief across the board. And even many abolitionists believed that, who thought slavery was evil and wanted to abolish slavery. But nonetheless, still saw this kind of racial hierarchy as being part of the way that the world was created and God designed the races. And this was so part of that actually. So point to this one in the Hebrew text. People read this back into the book of Genesis, and they basically read. There were kind of two competing versions of this. Sometimes they got conflated together, either the curse of Ham or the curse of Cain. That was a way of talking about the origins of brown-skinned people as different from the origins of light-skinned people, right? So that light-skinned people and Western Europeans can trace their lineage right back to Adam and Eve, to two beings that the text, has God very actively, very hands-on kind of creating. And then the other stories both actually point to either kind of, sexually shameful kinds of events and the curse of Ham, or to murder and the curse of Cain, right? So that Cain murders his brother Abel and then lies to God about it. And the text says that Cain was marked by God. And that's notable. The text doesn't say anything about race or skin, but that's how it got interpreted, I think, by white Christians really across the board, that this was the origin story of dark-skinned people on the planet. And so if you think about that, what it means is that in that origin story, the original ancestor, right, for black and brown people was a murderer, right? Somebody sort of morally suspect from the beginning in a way that doesn't, that kind of white people don't have that sort of taint on their origin story. And so it set up and reinforced this racial hierarchy there. And then I think the other one that's maybe a little more subtle, but that I think has been widespread in more contemporary Christianity is this idea of a individual and personal relationship with Jesus has actually functioned in ways that have hidden, I think, or prevented many white Christians from seeing structural racism in the country. So just a couple of points on that. And this was like very central to me. Like, so I grew up, I must have heard that phrase, a personal relationship with Jesus, every time I was at church, every time. What I heard absolutely none of was anything about civil rights, anything about, and I grew up in the 1970s and 80s in Mississippi, right? I remember things like the KKK demonstrating outside of our soccer field as we were heading to a game at Battlefield Park, which is where a civil war was fought in Jackson, Mississippi. And this was in, again, 70s and 80s. The Jackson public schools didn't get around to actually desegregating the schools until the early 70s, nearly 20 years after Brown v. Board of Education, mandated desegregation in the country. And so here I was living through, as a kid, not only seeing the first black kids show up at my school, but seeing the KKK demonstrating, on my way to soccer games. And my church said not one thing about any of that, right? It was just utterly invisible. And all the while emphasizing this personal relationship with Jesus. And I'm borrowing here some from the great work of Michael Emerson, who's also a sociologist of religion, who really, I think, uncovered some of this really 20 years ago in his own kind of sociological work. That one of the kind of limits is, he calls it a kind of individualist toolkit, that basically evangelicals, and I think white Christians even beyond evangelicalism, have become dominated by this idea that really the beginning and the end of authentic religion is this interior, hyper-individualistic sense of connection to God through Jesus, right? That is completely disconnected from anything going on in the world. And Martin Luther King, I'll end with this. Martin Luther King, I think, saw this so clearly in Letter from Birmingham Jail. In 1963, he's writing to the kind of upstanding kind of religious leaders of Birmingham, not the extremists, but the kind of civic leader types, Jewish and Christian in the city, and basically says, look, who are, he's kind of writing in dismay. And he has this great line where he says, who are these people? Who are these Christians sitting safely behind their anesthetizing stained glass windows, right? In the sense that it basically lulled white Christian consciences to sleep, so that you could simultaneously feel secure and good about your relationship with God through Jesus, while being completely disconnected and ignoring any kind of injustice outside the stained glass windows.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Robby. That and then that individual relationship with Jesus is only compounded by the individualism ethos in America. I mean, so it just goes hand in hand. All right, so I see a question in the chat from Rebecca, and then let's open it up to questions. Robby's already given us a lot to think about, so either put a question in the chat, or if you want to use your raise the hand thing, Julie and Chase will track when they see that and put people in order to ask questions. So I see 2 questions. Robby, can you see them there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Great. So the first one's among Christian groups. Were there any groups that scored better than a 7? So the highest one was white evangelicals, and then right behind that again there were 8. And again, higher is actually
Worse.
holding more racist views is higher, right? So 10 is holding the most racist views on all the questions across the board. A 1 is holding the least racist views. To give you a sense of it's here, so I'll kind of walk it down. So it's white evangelicals at 8, white mainline Protestants and white Catholics at 7, whites who are unaffiliated at 4, and African American Protestants at 2, right? So that's kind of the range that you see across the board. And Latino Catholics tend to look more like unaffiliated. They're around 4 or 5. So it really is the white Christian groups that stand out. And on question after question, I mean, it is really notable on questions around race, and particularly around systemic racism, how clustered the differences between white evangelicals and other white Christians are actually just differences of degree, not really of kind, even though I think we tend to think about there being much more distance between the National Association of Evangelicals and the National Council of Churches, for example, like these kind of two denominational umbrella groups. And theologically, that's true. But on this issue around race and purely structural racism, we just don't see the distinctions just aren't that big.
Okay, and I see from Susan in the chat. That's a really deep question. So I don't know. And then I see Krista and Laura have a hand up.
So the biblical text one, so I do think that white Christians I would use the word connect their views to the biblical text, which is different than relying on. I think the model, certainly that I grew up thinking about, was that you read the biblical text, it tells you something about, it kind of goes from text to the world, like that direction. I think there's actually much more evidence, particularly on issues of race, that white Christians have read their white supremacy back into the text rather than the other way around, right? So I think if we take that seriously, I think the way that it changes is the white supremacist views have to be challenged and changed, and then the way people read the Bible changes. Now that's backwards from, I think, the way we're often taught that it goes, but I really do think that there's much more evidence by my lights that that's the way it ends up working, that those theological views tend to shift as other views shift, and often on other grounds. So transformation. It's also a really important question. I think I'd go back to, and I think the reason why I took the trouble to write the book is, one, it was a book I kind of need to write myself just to get clarity, and again, kind of wrestling with my own sorts of cognitive dissonance. So I think that was important. But I had a hunch that I wasn't the only one wrestling with these kinds of things, and so I think transformation, I keep going back to this. I think it's right. I think this cognitive dissonance piece is really important. Transformation begins when you just begin to be uncomfortable with the things that you took to be truths, in the world, and you begin to be presented with counter evidence. And most often it comes through relationships, right? You begin to be in relationship with people who challenge those views, or it's not philosophical or propositional. I think it tends to be communal and relational, as certainly I think can be the case that most, when I've changed my views on something big, it really has been because somebody I love and care about held a different view, and really kept pushing me on it. And I think that's there. I do think the narrative piece of this is really important, that particularly for white Christians to start doing our own narrative work, and that is telling our own stories, telling our family's stories, and telling our communities' stories, and doing that together in a way that I think helps us re-understand our history in a way that isn't, I think most churches who've been around very long tend to write a history of the church, and it talks about the founders, and the founders are always great, and the people who founded the church were always good-hearted, and there's certainly truth to that, but I think thinking about how do we retell our own histories in a way that doesn't sweep all of this under the rug, pretend like we were in the right side of the civil rights movement, pretend like we took courageous stands that we didn't. I think telling the truth about that, and kind of these alternative ways of understanding things are part of kind of healing, I think, and moving us to a new place.
Also, Robby, I want to jump in here. Then I can ask the questions so that you can people can hear them as well. But also, I think that in terms of reading scripture, we all bring our own lenses, right? And the lenses are our own social context, our own racial context, and our own economic context, even of our own lives. So, I will never forget when I was in South Africa and the story of, Nathan, the prophet, saying to David, basically telling him a story, right, about Bathsheba, and so the Bible study leader said, what was David's sin? And the white Christian said, oh, it was adultery, and the black South African Christians said, no, it was that a rich man stole from a poor man. And that was just such a profound shift, right? How we read the text. So I think there is some hope that if we can really look at the context we have. My colleague, Ben McBride from Oakland, says, can you read the gospel through the eyes or with the lens of Ferguson? Read the gospel through the lens of Ferguson and see how that gospel speaks. And I think as white Christians, read the lens of the Gospels and the Hebrew Bible through the lens of what's going on with the racial reckoning in our country, and it could be really profound. Were the Jewish or Muslims' faith included in this research?
Yes. So all the data in the book relies primarily on nationally representative surveys that were conducted in 2018 and 2019 by my organization and some others, but the two principal ones were conducted by PRRI. So those surveys, by the way, if you want to look at the whole survey, which covers much more ground than just what I cover in the book, they're up and available at prrri.org, which is our website. But everyone was included, but it was a survey of 2,500 Americans, which is about 2.5 times the size of the typical political survey, like the ones we're seeing from CNN or Washington Post and all that today. Most political surveys are 1,000 people. This one was 2,500, so that we could break out particularly people by race. We don't have enough. For example, Jews are about 2% of the U.S. population. Muslims are about 1% of the U.S. population. So at 2,500, we don't have enough to break them out. They're in the survey, and so the national numbers they influence, but we don't have enough to break them out separately and look at their attitudes separately.
Great. I'm going to ask Julie or Chase. I've got a private text saying that a lot of people have had their hands up. So Julie and Chase, do you have a list? If so, can one of you jump in? No? Okay. I've got it on speaker view, so let me see who's got a hand up.
Sorry, I don't see hands, so I'm not sure.
Okay. Verl, did you see
They can just unmute themselves if you have a question.
Or put it in the text.
Or raise your hand visually. I'm not seeing the...
Okay.
Okay.
And maybe, or Verl, if you've seen a hand, if you want to call on somebody, because you seem to see the hands.
I see Sherry Aldridge with a hand up, and I see
Pat Pepper.
Is Pat has her hand up? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, Pat, and then Cheryl.
Oh, you want me to ask something, or can I ask him something?
Yes.
Okay, I'm on, in other
Yeah,
words.
go ahead.
I just wanted to ask you, I seem to be a little bit confused, at least right now. I grew up Southern Baptist in Southern Kentucky. And when we talk about evangelicals, to me, I probably didn't think about anything like this when I was growing up, but when I'm looking back on it now, the evangelicals to me were not what I could classify now within the Baptist Church or the Southern Baptist Convention. And am I wrong? Maybe I'm wrong in this, that as I seem to hear you including particularly the Southern Baptist Convention, which I know has turned lots of corners since I grew up, into evangelicals. To me, evangelicals when I was growing up and even now were these outside groups that were not connected with the people in my town. You know, I mean, there were some in my town, but they weren't connected with the Baptists, the Methodists, the Episcopals, the Presbyterians, and so on. And I hear you now saying that based on the basis of the Baptist convention or the Baptist background, that they're included. Is that a decent question?
No, it's a great question, and it's funny. So even so again, I kind of came of age in the 70s and 80s, and I think I would say the same thing. If you had asked our little church, 250 people, were we evangelical? I don't know that we would have used that term, right, to describe ourselves there. So I think you're probably right that Southern Baptists kind of eschewed that term growing up. So I should just be clear that I'm kind of using the term the way that social science uses the term today. Rather than relying on the way that it might be used by an insider. So the way that, and in that world, the Southern Baptists absolutely get included into the evangelical world of things. So like Presbyterians get divided between the PCUSA, which is in the mainline category, and the PCA, Presbyterian Church in America, which is kind of on the evangelical side. The Missouri Synod Lutherans are on the evangelical side. The ELCA Lutherans are on the mainline side. So, welcome to the crazy, messy world of the sociology of religion. But I think for sociological purposes, we tend to put people who kind of self-identify as, one of the ways to think about it is people who identify as born again or evangelical, who might use that language. Those people we kind of put in the evangelical bucket, where those who tend not to talk about themselves that way, we put in the mainline Protestant bucket.
Thank you, Robby.
But it's messy. Yeah, you're right. It's messy.
Right. And you can always find somebody either more liberal or more conservative than you that you can put in a category, right? I mean, yeah. That's part of it too. Okay, Cheryl Eldridge.
No, I did not have my hand raised, so I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem.
There's some questions here in the chat.
Okay.
One is, how do you recommend for white churches to partner with Black churches?
Yeah, it's a great question. So at the end of the book, I go looking for, some bright spots. Really is one way to put it, of places that are, kind of doing this work. And I also kind of tried to connect it to my own journey here. So I spent some time in Macon, Georgia, where my parents grew up, and my sort of family goes way back. And there are actually two Baptist churches, or actually two First Baptist churches of Macon. Right. And the reason there are two First Baptist churches in Macon is that they used to be the same church in 1820. Right. And that they split into one predominantly white church and one predominantly Black church around the Civil War. The African American church eventually gets its own independence after the war. And then basically these two churches, who were located literally around the corner and up the hill from each other, you could throw a golf ball from one parking lot to the other. See one steeple from the other, ignored each other for 150 years. I mean, they lived completely separate lives, completely segregated communities, even though they were physically right there, until about 7 years ago. And the two pastors of the churches just looked at, kind of said, "What are we doing? Like, why are we sitting right here together, completely isolated?" And they're not up to kind of remerge the churches or anything, but they have began, and actually they began a covenanted relationship where they went very deliberately 7 years ago into this commitment to try to build community between the two churches. And it's meant small things like Easter egg rolls for the kids, and there's a park kind of in the middle of the two, Easter egg rolls for the kids and potlucks in the park to just help people get to know each other. They've done some joint kind of studies. They've actually done some joint trips, including one very recently to the Museum for Peace and Healing in Montgomery, which is the museum commemorating the victims of lynching in Montgomery. which was I think a really, that's a trip they could not have taken 7 years ago. But after building community for 7 years, I think they were in a place where they thought they could actually, so they took one bus, half black, half white, went there, came back and had a reflection service about the experience. But I think the whole thing has been actually fairly transformational for both churches, but I would say particularly for the white Christian church in there, because they've had to face some really troubling parts of their history. Like, for example, they committed to kind of going back and looking at the early records of the church and trying to get a more straightforward story of exactly how those two churches came apart and what the origins were. And for example, they turned up that they had, there was a time early in the church's history where they were having trouble paying the bills. They had a mortgage due. The pastor hadn't been paid in a couple of months. And one of the ways that they balanced the books is that one of the white families sold some of their slaves who were also members of the church. So they essentially sold members of their own church to pay the bills for the pastor and the mortgage. And the pastor, had the courage, I think, to preach on this the next Sunday and to really help them come to terms with this. And there was like an audible gasp. I've listened to the audio. There was an audible gasp in the sanctuary when he kind of laid this out. And then, said, like, we have to reckon with this. I mean, this is part of who we are. It is, and it has to be part of what we're wrestling with as we're trying to be in more honest relationship, with these people. So I think it's kind of, yes, there's work I think that white Christians can do on their own. I also think there is work that is best done in community with African Americans, exactly as you're saying, Reverend Nixon, that because I think it is those relationships that keeps calling us to take a different perspective or to see a different perspective. Just real quickly, I know we're close to time, but there's a story about those two churches too, that where basically the white pastor says, I would like to think that when Trayvon Martin was killed in Florida, that we would have, that would have been central to our church. Like, we would have prayed about it, we would have preached about it. He says, but I'm not sure we would have if we hadn't been in a relationship with this other church. But we knew we had to show up with them on this just because of these relations. It just wasn't a question. He said it at least would have been optional. We probably wouldn't have, maybe a quick acknowledgement, but it would have been a blip on the radar rather than something that we paused and made sure we were standing with, our brothers and sisters in the other church with. So I think those kinds of relationships, they do make a difference, and I think have to be ultimately part of the transformation.
Great. Let's end with this question. What explains the more limited racism of the unaffiliated? Just that they weren't socialized in a relatively racist white churches, or are there positive elements of their socialization?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's pretty complicated, obviously, but I think the thing is that they don't have, it's more of an absence, I think, on the one hand, that they don't have this Christian identity that I think has served in many ways to occlude this moral vision. And I think that's really part of the way that I think about it, is that one of the things, again, like that image from King, I think is dead on. That Christian faith has really served in many ways to blunt white Christian, instead of enliven white Christian consciences, it served to blunt them. Instead of kind of waking us up, it served to put us to sleep and to make us feel okay, right? I mean, I think there's a real reason for that, right? It was to make us feel okay Sunday after Sunday with all of this injustice swirling around, and to keep it from having purchase on us, right? At the end of the day, the one thing I'll say about this trip, there was a guy from the white church in Macon. Goes to this point, who was worried, who almost didn't sign up to go on this joint trip to the lynching memorial in Macon. And when he finally showed up, he said, "Okay, I'm going to go." And when they were doing the reflection afterward, he said, "The reason I struggle with this so much about going," he said, "my fear and my hope, I realized after thinking about it for a while, that my fear and my hope were the same. And that is that I would feel responsible." Right? And that I was worried if I went, I would feel responsible. And I wasn't sure I was ready for that. And I was worried that, what I would have to do, really, it would be costly to me if I really did begin to feel responsible. And I think that the Christian identity part has been the piece that in many ways has helped whites not be responsible and not feel responsible. So I think in some ways it's that lack of that apparatus, right? That's kind of dulling, lulling, that I think has put unaffiliated folks in a different spot. And I should say too, many of those folks were raised religious, right? And many of them left precisely because it didn't give them purchase on the things that they thought were the most important things in the world, right? And racial injustice is like certainly high on the list there. And I think they found the churches to be simply irrelevant to many of those concerns.
Thank you so much, Robby. I mean, we could listen for a lot longer. I wish we could have you for a series of four programs like this to go deeper. But I really do, white too long. Don't let the statistical stuff scare you off. Like Robby said, he put it in one chapter. And for those of you that like that stuff, there's a whole appendices that's incredible. But I want to call it out and say it's super readable, very accessible. It's part memoir, so you're really captured by Robby's own story, which I think will reflect some of your own. Let me, if I might, Robby, even though the author is right here, end with Robby's conclusion in his book, which is so powerful. He's talking about racial reconciliation, and he said, whites, and especially white Christians, have seen this project, i.e. racial reconciliation, as an altruistic one, rather than a desperate life and death struggle for their own future. What few whites perceive, and this is the truth that has come late to me, is that we have far more at stake than our black fellow citizens in setting things right. As Baldwin provocatively put it, the civil rights movement began when an oppressed and despised people began to wake up collectively to what had happened to them. The question today is whether we white Christians will also awaken to see what has happened to us and to grasp once and for all how white supremacy has robbed us of our own heritage and our own ability to be in right relationship with our fellow citizens, with ourselves, and even with God. Reckoning with white supremacy for us is now an unavoidable moral choice. Whew. Let the people say amen and God help us.
Amen.
Yeah. Robby, thank you so much.
Thank you all.
So deep, so good. And we promise to you that we here at CCSM will continue to do our work. So you have partners here.
Well, I firmly believe this is where it's going to happen. So it's going to happen in local communities, in conversations like this, and at work on the ground. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for taking
Thanks.
your time.
Thank you.